we don't expand our imagination.
Justification for being what you are.
And welcome to Washington Unplugged. Bob Schieffer here. Well, it is something that happens only every 10 years. Maybe that's because getting 309 million people to fill out a survey is no small feat. But just a few minutes ago, the 2010 U.S. Census was released, and its new findings have the potential to change the 2012 political landscape. CBS's Nancy Cordes is going to join us from Capitol Hill with some highlights of the census report this year. The census, of course, is incredibly transparent, but in the Washington Post this week, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Dana Priest has been investigating secret programs collecting information on Americans. She's going to share some of her findings today. Then Washington Unplugged's political year in review. Who were 2010's best and worst candidates? What was the biggest political headline? We'll share our political team's picks today. But first to the Capitol and Nancy Cordes. Well, Nancy, in a nutshell, what's the big headline out of the census this year?
Well, the big headline, Bob, the thing that everybody always wants to know is how many people live in the United States. And so drum roll, please. We have now been informed that exactly 308,745 and 308 million people now live in the U.S. How's that for botching the headline? But that's a growth of about 9.7% over the past 10 years. We have broken through the 300 million barrier, and back in 2000 we had about 280 million, so this is a big jump. But in the South and in the West, we were being told the jump is much, much bigger. South up 14% in population, the West up 14% in population. Compare that to the Midwest, the industrial heartland of this country, only up 4%, the Northeast just up 3%.
All right, well, let's talk about the political impact, because this is going to be more congressmen for some states, fewer congressmen for other states. Who's going to gain, who's going to lose here?
That's right. Well, this is going to have a big impact on congressional representation, and we're seeing a decades-long trend of seats being lost in the Northeast, lost in the Midwest, and gaining in the South and in the West. So what we learned today is that Texas is the big winner. It's going to gain 4 congressional seats. Florida is going to gain 2 seats, and then Arizona, Georgia, South Carolina, Utah, Washington, and Nevada will each gain an additional congressional district. But there are a host of states that are going to be losing seats. New York and Ohio will each lose 2 congressional seats. This was a big surprise for New York. They thought they might lose 1. They're surprised they're losing 2. And then there's another 8 states who are going to lose 1 congressional district as well. Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Michigan, and New Jersey. And Bob, that is a tough list to read on the same day that you've had 4 cavities filled. My mouth is still getting back in working order here.
But let's talk a little bit about Texas and Florida gaining seats. This is, I would have to take it, good news for Republicans, because I guess the population growth in Texas is going to be around areas now that are heavily Republican. So this is probably going to bode well for the Republican Party down there. I'm not as familiar with the situation in Florida, but how does that seem to break down?
Well, this is good news for Republicans, not just because of Texas, but also because they're picking up seats in other southern states that are Republican strongholds like Georgia and South Carolina. And, of course, the Northeast, which is a Democratic stronghold, is losing a bunch of seats. So this is fantastic news for Republicans, especially because they won in so many state houses across the country in the November elections. So they are going to be the ones who have the power to redraw those congressional maps, figure out where exactly they want to place that new seat so that it looks like a likely pickup for them.
And this is one of the reasons we talked about this on election night, when you saw these Republican gubernatorial pickups in the various states, because generally it is the governor of a state who sort of controls the state party machinery, and he will be the one that will be the driving force in the redrawing of a lot of these districts, which are generally done by the state legislatures. So tell me again now, how many people now live in the United States? I want to hear you say that headline again.
Okay, let's try it again. 308,745,538.
Wow. Give or take.
Yeah, 1 or 2.
Whatever. Nancy Cordes in playing in the starting lineup, even though she just had 4 cavities filled. Thank you very much. It's
Thanks,
great
Bob.
to have you this morning,
Sure
Nancy.
thing.
And we're going to turn now to another first-teamer, Dana Priest of the Washington Post, who, while Nancy's reporting on stuff that is all public, you're talking about some surveys and some information you've gotten that's all about really secret stuff, and that is the government checking up on folks when sometimes we don't know they're checking up on us. You have a big series in the Washington Post. Tell me about it.
Well, what we looked at is what the United States is doing at the state and local level to try to find terrorists. And what they're doing is now monitoring you and I much more, U.S. citizens and residents. They're doing that with the help of state and local governments and police. Your beat cop, they've started a campaign to try to get them to feed the FBI information through something called the Suspicious Activity Report. And that means if a police officer, a sheriff's deputy, or even a citizen sees somebody doing something they think is suspicious, you're extra curious about a building that you shouldn't be curious about, you're taking a photograph of a bridge, they can fill out this form, get your license plate if you've got a car, run a bunch of information on you, and then, because technology has changed so much, they can use commercial databases to find out your social security number, your cell phone number, all the places you've lived before. And this goes into a central database at the FBI headquarters called the Guardian database. And part of that is shared with local and state, thousands of local and state officials who will wait for some more information to figure out, well, is this person really doing something we should be concerned about? Because the vast majority of these cases, these reports, they can't tell. It looks suspicious, but they don't know whether to rule it in or rule it out. So it'll sit in this database, your personal information, sit in this database for up to 5 years, waiting for some other tip, some other bit of information that might make them think this is a real case. We need to start an investigation.
So you wind up on these watch lists, and
you could wind up on a watch list that way. More likely, you're going to have a lot more information about you in these files, including, and this is really, I thought, so interesting, if you drive from Washington, D.C. to New York, there's now a whole series of cameras that your car will pass through. And if they decided that you look really suspicious, they want to know more about you, they could actually trace where you went and when you went. If you went in tunnels, if you went over bridges. We've become a surveillance society for reasons that the government will argue are completely legitimate, which is they're much more worried about so-called homegrown terrorists. You've seen them, the guy who allegedly tried to blow up the tree lighting ceremony in Portland, and then another man who was arrested in Baltimore for wanting to blow up an Army recruiting station. So they believe that this is now the big problem. It's still overseas, but now it's Americans and recent immigrants that are becoming radicalized for various reasons that they've got to look for. They're not communicating with a network of people, so they can't eavesdrop on them in websites, and they're much more difficult to find, so they're trying to unleash all the departments, and you and me. You see Janet Napolitano, the Secretary of Homeland Security, out there saying, see something, say something. That's part of this. Or you see these signs all over Washington and other parts of the country that say, report suspicious activity. They've just popped up. It's all part of this campaign to get you involved, report on people.
I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that we have to be more vigilant. But this really does sound like some of the things that went on during the Cold War. I mean, I'm old enough to remember Joe McCarthy and the list of 400 people that are members of the Communist Party that he claimed to have, that he said worked at the State Department. And of course, all that was just a myth. None of it was true. But I mean, I think we are redefining the whole idea of privacy in this country now, and some people willingly. I mean, people who are willing to put things on Facebook and some of these social networking things that, my heavens, I wouldn't want my closest friends to know about, and people seem to share that information.
Well, I
now.
had a reader call in yesterday after reading the story say, do you think the authorities are looking at Facebook pages? I said, of course they're looking at Facebook pages. You know, there is so much out there that is not necessarily law enforcement, but it's available to law enforcement, and they're going to use it because they want to get more information. The big debate, even within the FBI, is whether this is really the effective way to go about it. Most terrorism cases come about, maybe they start as a tip, but then the FBI uses its confidential sources, surveillance technology that's very targeted to an individual. And this, as a critic, as a skeptic described to me, is like piling more hay on a haystack to try to find the needle, because it really is collecting thousands of tips from all over the country, trying to weed through them and see what is worth going after.
You know, that's a very good point, because I remember in the early parts of the Iraq War, when we had tape after tape piling up over at the Justice Department, where we'd been monitoring all these conversations that so-called enemies were making, but we didn't have enough interpreters to look at it. And the longer it went on, the worse it got. I'm sure there's some tapes over there they still haven't gotten to, and this sounds like we're headed kind of the same direction here. What has been the response of the government to your story?
Well, they put out a 7-page, put out is probably a generous term, they gave a 7-page document of talking points addressing everything in the article to members of Congress and people in the executive so that they would know how to respond to it. It didn't say any part was inaccurate, but it did say it gave their reasoning for all of this, and the reasoning was stated in the article, which is they do believe this is the way they need to find this next generation, if you want to call it that, of homegrown terrorists working by themselves.
Did they give you the talking points, or
no? Someone sent them to me.
A source?
Yes, a source.
I see. Well, it's a fine piece of reporting, Dana,
Thank you.
as you always do with these pieces in the Washington Post. So thanks very much, and we want to check with you from time to time to see how this is going. Now we're going to have a little fun. Because we're kicking off Washington Unplugged's political year in review. Midterm elections, health care reform, don't ask, don't tell. There were plenty of stories to keep our politics team busy in 2010. And so we polled the correspondents, producers, political analysts that followed all these stories closely. And today we're going to talk about their picks for the best and worst candidate of 2010, plus the biggest political story of the year. And CBS News senior political producer Rob Hendon is joining us at the table now to talk about that. First, to our nominees for the best candidate of the year. Our nominees were Scott Brown in Massachusetts, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, Marco Rubio in Florida, and Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. And the winner is Scott Brown.
Scott Brown, that is right.
And why?
Well, no one had heard of the Tea Party really, or thought much of them until Scott Brown came on the scene. He was down double digits leading into the seat for the election for Ted Kennedy's seat, and just came out of nowhere and took the country by storm. He said he was going to be the 41st vote against healthcare reform. He was a vote against healthcare reform, not the killing vote, obviously, but no one had heard of him, and he came out of nowhere, and he really turned the.
And who did the team select as the worst candidate of the year?
Well, as the yin and the yang, the candidate he defeated, Martha Coakley, the Massachusetts Attorney General, who was running as the heir apparent to the Kennedy seat, she kind of didn't see the Brown election coming and therefore got the worst candidate of the year.
And let's see, what is our nominees, let's see, for the pick of the biggest political story of the year? And I believe we had a tie there. Rob, who were the nominees?
We had the president signing health care reform into law in March. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal, it's just blocked and then passed just this past weekend. WikiLeaks, something we've all been talking about. The GOP winning the midterm, the historic landslide there, and the Slurpee summit afterwards with the president. The Ground Zero mosque debate, and then finally the Tea Party politics, including Sarah Palin and Glenn Beck.
And who is the winner?
Well, we had a tie, and these are kind of, they go together. The tie from our CBS News political team was healthcare reform being signed and the GOP midterm election. So they kind of go hand in hand.
I actually voted in this survey. I voted for the midterm election. I thought that was the biggest story. Why did people think healthcare reform was equal to that?
I think it was, in fact, it's a once-in-a-generation kind of reform the president put so much political capital on the table for. and he worked so hard for it that once they got it, it was a big deal. But I voted for healthcare reform because it led to the GOP midterms, because it changed the dynamic. The Democrats thought it was a key win, going to be an issue that they were going to win moderates and independents on. The Republicans were able to mobilize so viciously against it, and that's still happening, that it really, I think that was the story of the year, and that's why I think it tied with the midterms.
I guess we didn't have a category, but we should have had a category, I think, for the most physically harmful story of the year. That would have to go to President Obama getting hit in the chin with somebody's elbow while he was trying to play basketball. I mean, he wasn't having a very good couple of months there, and it sort of was climaxed by that.
Yes.
But I'm told that he's back to eating solid food now, and everything's working fine. So, Rob Hendon, thank you very much. Our political year in review will continue tomorrow when we will unveil our picks for the best and worst presidential moment. Well, maybe that'll be in there. I don't remember. Anyway, that's it for Washington Unplugged today, and join us here every day at 12:30 on CBSNews.com. Bob Schieffer here. I hope you have a good day.